Hello everybody, and welcome to the fifth in our little series on church architecture and spirituality. I've entitled this Baptisms, Burials and Basilicas. Last time we talked about the earliest Christian communities who met in private houses like this one to celebrate the agape meal and to tell stories about Jesus and to remember him until he returned to earth to establish the kingdom of God. Christianity wasn't an officially approved religion, so it's hardly surprising that these meetings were held in buildings that weren't immediately recognizable as specifically Christian, but looked a lot more like private houses. A little bit later on, we're going to look at a perfect example of this transition from a private house, like this one of the lovers in Pompeii, to convert it into a multi-purpose church. The example we're going to look at is a UNESCO World Heritage Site in Croatia. Now, Christianity is a religion that's founded on the incarnation and the teaching and the death and resurrection of Jesus, so it's hardly surprising that the liturgies celebrated by those early Christians and the buildings associated with them should reflect these central ideas. And that's why I've called this section Baptisms, Burials and Basilicas. The house meal around a table in the triclinium was a remembering of the life and the death and the resurrection of Jesus. Baptisms were held not usually in these private homes, but in running water outside, or as in the case of Justin Martyr, who held his teaching in the second floor of an apartment building. He performed baptisms in the public baths that could be found on the first floor. And these baptisms, obviously, are the way in which an individual Christian enters into Christ's death and resurrection. These are two early baptismal fonts here from Paros in Greece in the shape of a cross, and at San Giovanni in Fonte, the Lateran Baptistery in Rome. Tombs were places of hope, places of promise for Christians. Those who died trusting in Jesus' saving death and resurrection, especially the martyrs, would one day be raised in glory. Here we can see a Christian necropolis on the left in Hungary, with Adam and Eve on the frieze on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side you can see the Malterium church of St. Babilas in Antioch. A floor plan in a Greek cross, just as we saw the font in the shape of a Greek cross, the connection between entering into Christ's death in the font and entering into Christ's resurrection here at the place of burial in the Malterium church. Now, private houses and clubs were perfect places for commemorative meals, but baptisms and burials were just as important in the development of Christian architecture. And today, we're going to see how house church, where meals were celebrated, evolved into buildings that were distinctively Christian. How did they manage to combine baptisms, burials, and memorial meals in one building? And how did this evolution into one building give rise to the beautiful and famous basilicas constructed in Rome at the time of Constantine the Great? Let's go back for a moment to the private house in Dura Europos that we looked at last time. Now, a curious feature of this little house is the fact that the main meeting room, there marked number 4, the assembly room, seems to have been decorated only with a frieze of the pagan god Bacchus, whereas the smaller baptistery, up there on the top right, marked 6, was elaborately decorated with scenes from the Bible, with stars and fruit and flowers. Was this just because they never really got round to decorating the room in which the memorial meal was held before the town was partially destroyed in 256 AD? Or was it because the room where the catechumens were initiated, the baptistery, was considered to be of such major importance that it was decorated first and decorated most lavishly? Here you can see the wall paintings in the baptistery of the woman at the well on the left, perhaps Mary or Mary Magdalene, Jesus saving Peter there in the middle, and the healing of the paralytic there on the right. Now, it's also important to notice that the baptistery is completely separate from the meeting hall. And the bottom of the picture on the right there, we can see the meeting hall. And this is something that we're going to see developing in the centuries to come, a separate baptistery from the meeting hall. A baptistery is also very static. You can't move a font like that, whereas the meeting hall itself would have had movable furniture, table, chairs, for those people who were presiding, and a reading desk perhaps. So that must have meant that those early church memorial meals were quite dynamic things for moving people, not like the fixed liturgical spaces that developed a bit later on when official churches were built and the shared meal was celebrated symbolically around a stone altar by eating a fragment of bread and drinking a sip of wine. Now, you can already see this happening in Dura Europus. The rooms are separate from each other, a meeting room with a raised platform, a baptistery, and a little room for the catechumens here marked 5 to listen separately from and apart from the main meeting for the initiated. That room 5 may also have been a teaching room. The institutionalization of Christian worship's already begun here in this building, just 200 years after Jesus' ministry. And you can already see that the formalization of a space for the meal with a raised platform meant that the normal intrusions of everyday life were minimized because the dining room gradually filled with objects and furniture that just had exclusively Christian meanings, and people began to live out the roles that the created liturgical spaces imposed on them. It's also interesting to speculate that this little shift from a domestic space in which the host and hostess, importantly, welcomed people into their private dining room, the evolution from this period to a sacred space of Christian liturgy with appointed male leaders perhaps marginalized women's roles in this evolving early church when they were the hostesses of these meetings. Now, we've already seen that most of the meetings of early Christians were shared meals, actual or symbolic. Here we can see a shared agape meal from the Catacombs in Rome, where Christians came together and they learned about their faith, they shared their experiences. They also looked after each other, and there's clear evidence that some of these rooms in these early Christian houses were set aside for clothing and other belongings that were given out to the poor. And these converted houses were also places of learning. Some of them contained a separate Christian library. But in addition to these sacred meals and communal meetings, Christians also held funerary meetings to honour the deceased figures in the Jesus movement, the apostles initially, the people who knew Jesus during his earthly ministry, and then those leading figures who were great teachers or martyrs in the spread of Christianity. Now, on the surface, these little funerary traditions were very similar to pagan funerary traditions. The Romans would gather around the burial site and they would share food with the deceased through offerings that were left on top of the sarcophagus or through a little funnel, as you can see here, that led inside. Here you can see a Roman sarcophagus with a man and woman reclining on the top of it in a position that reminds us of people's position in the triclinium, reclining to eat. Now, the rooms where the agape meal was held were usually oblong, arranged on a sort of longitudinal plan, but the space around a burial site was more circular, developing the Christian martyrium around a sort of centralized circular plan. Here you can see the church of Veracruz near Segovia on the right, distinctively circular there, and St. Gerion in Cologne below, where you can see this unusual shape of a circle with a sort of protruding basilica-like form on the right-hand side, culminating in an apse. In this early Christian period, buildings with circular or polyagonal or polygonal and a Greek cross plan were devoted to two things. If they were circular or polygonal or Greek cross. They were either for baptisms or for burials. The spaces themselves were quite small. Baptisms and burials didn't require huge assembly spaces like the communal meal did. In fact, the spaces were designed to be enclosed and mysterious, a little bit like a tomb, with only the minister and the catechumens and the sponsors who were present to witness the person passing through death to rebirth in Christ. Now, in these centralized buildings, the font, the sarcophagus of the deceased, or a relic of the deceased were the centers of attention. And that's why we can see that baptisteries were often small rooms within or attachments to larger buildings. So here you can see a baptistery on the right, and the Church of St. George in Zora in Syria, with the tomb at the center of it. And here you can see the Martyrion of Saint Babilas in Antioch in Syria. And this central square with the 4 protruding arms of the cross around it, this central square is the focal point. The platform for the clergy was raised there, and it was placed next to the sarcophagus of the saint. This is pretty early. This is around 381 AD. And we can see that the special dead were given this special sort of cult. But this wasn't unique to Christians. You can see it in Greek and Roman practices too. Here's the round mausoleum of the Emperor Augustus. And here you can see it. The actual tomb was in this sort of central drum-like construction here, with a place for offerings around it and the assembly of the family, or those who came to pay their respects to the deceased. Now, people used to think that the Roman catacombs were an example of the special dead being a special cult. People gathering in secret around these loculi, these slots in the walls where famous Christians might have been buried. Or in the cubiculum, you can see here, this is a sort of square, open space with arcosolia around where the coffins or sarcophagi would have been placed. But it's likely perhaps that these larger cubicula were used for those services. But even those were too small for this sort of ritual. So by the 200s, when open-air cemeteries appeared, dedicated funerary buildings called martyria were constructed. Here you can see a cubiculum on the left with the platform for the sarcophagus, and a rather fanciful picture of early Christians going down into the catacombs to worship there. Now, these martyria often looked like pagan mausoleums. They were often built into a circular plan, as we can see here in Santo Stefano, the Rotundo in Rome, dating from 455 AD. A Mithraeum actually is currently being excavated under the church dedicated to Mithras, so clearly this was built on a site that was already sacred. So these were built in this circular plan, or sometimes there'd be a courtyard with a sort of apse surrounding the tomb of the martyr. Here you can see the exterior of St. Stephen's Church in Rome, clearly a circular form here. Now, you can also see this in the earliest building of St. Peter's in Rome. When a large meeting hall was required, a basilica, it would have a long assembly hall with an apse at one end, as you can see here on the right. Now, this was attached to the Malterium, which you can see at the very top there. That little bulging apse at the top is built over the top of St. Peter himself. On the bottom there, you can see a rather interesting projection of this. Obviously, there we can see the modern building of St. Peter's at the top, and you can see what lies underneath it, beneath. So you can see number 1 there, under the barley sugar columns of the high altar, is the tomb of St. Peter himself. Here perhaps you can see it a little bit more clearly. Here's the Circus of Nero, which was demolished essentially to make the Basilica of St. Peter's in Rome. And that other dotted plan you can see around it is the modern day St. Peter's. Now, there are many examples of these martyria from the late 200s all through the 300s, and perhaps the most famous of these is the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. It was built about 333 by Constantine. Here you can see the classic plan of the circular place around the cave in which, or the stable in which Jesus was born, with a basilica and an atrium and an entrance hall to its left. Here you can see a little 18th century watercolour of what that might have looked like, the little cave there on the left-hand side of the site of Jesus' birth. He also commissioned the first freestanding Christian martyrium, the Anastasis Rotunda, over the site where Jesus was said to have been entombed. It was large enough, that circle there on the left, to accommodate lots of worshippers. It was later attached to an atrium and a basilica. Here you can see the courtyard and the rotunda on the far left, the edicule. We shall look at this a little bit later on. Ordinary people could also be buried in proximity to the sacred tomb, and here we can see that the martyrium, the Anastasis Rotunda, and the basilica there on the right are now joined in one space. It's not just a burial place that's separate from the place where you hold the communal meal. The two have been fused. Unlike the assembly rooms, though, or dining rooms of earlier times, those triclinium, the entire atmosphere of the martyrium here is infused with the divine power that flows from the actual place where Jesus was born or where a saint was buried. Here you can see a sort of the simplified cross-section of it, with the dome over the edicule here, the inhumation chamber, the current church, and the rock of Golgotha, where Jesus was said to be crucified. You can see here that all of these things are combined into one building. Now we're going to look at the beautiful Croatian building I mentioned at the beginning. Here it is in Poreč, in Croatia, up there towards Trieste, to the north of the Adriatic Sea. And here is a view of the port and the basilica that's rising there up in the background. The Euphratesian Basilica in Poreč in Croatia began life as a private house. And this is actually the third church to have been built on the site due to earthquakes and fires and accidents. This is a ground plan of it. What you can see here marked 4 should be coming to be familiar to you now. It's a sort of roundish thing. I wonder if that might be the Baptistery, and indeed it is. And then you have the atrium there marked 3, and the basilica there marked 26, and a little apse at the top marked 23 here and 27. Now, traces of the original private house have survived, and here you can see the mosaic of the original Roman houses in the garden outside. Here you can see another picture of it with the basilica on the right. The first official church on the site was built in the late 300s, but the building was used for Christian meals before this official church was built on it. And the mosaic of this original church, original dining room, this original Roman house, in this fish mosaic that was dating from the floor from this period. And they found coins of the Emperor Valens, who reigned from about 365 to 378 during the excavations. And so that must prove that the date of the mosaic predates this. Now, the present basilica dates from 553, and it's built on the site of an older basilica that had fallen into disrepair after nearly 200 years of constant use. And the beautiful mosaics with golden grounds date from that particular period. And what you can see here in this ground plan is very interesting. It looks like a jumble, doesn't it, at first sight, but it actually makes sense when you bear in mind the process that we've just described. The access area, marked number 1 there at the bottom of the picture, looks like the entrance to a domestic house. There it is on the right. If it didn't have this golden mosaic over the door, it might just be the entrance to a very nice Roman house. It's quite low-key. Here you can see it again from the street level. Doesn't look like a church from the outside, but like we were mentioning a little bit before. Here is the atrium as you first walk in. Now we're beginning to look like a church, but here is an open courtyard that corresponds to the impluvium of those Roman houses that we saw earlier on. And there's another view of this little atrium here with these wonderful Roman columns. The baptistery is a separate building on the other side of the atrium from the main basilica. Here you can see the octagonal baptistery whose ground plan we saw a moment ago, and here is the baptismal font itself in the middle of it. Now there are other domestic rooms arranged around the main centres of the ritual, the basilica and the baptistery. There's a little martyrium to the north of the basilica, and to the north of the atrium there's a little episcopal reception area where bishops could receive people. And here you can see it on this particular picture. Now here's what became of that basilica a few hundred years later. Clearly this is no longer a private dining room of a private house. It's been basilicafied and turned into a place where this communal meal can be celebrated. It's clearly a basilica with a central aisle and 2 side aisles with windows there and a clerestory above with the windows, and there this wonderful mosaic in the apse. Here's a close-up of this very beautiful apse in this basilica. There with the Virgin Mary holding Christ on her knee, surrounded by these wonderful figures, the angel attendants to right and left, and then the martyrs on either side here. And that's what it looks like today. It gives you some idea of the size of the thing. Next week, we're going to explore the enormous influence of the conversion of the Emperor Constantine. And we're going to discover that his building program and the building program of Constantine's mother, Helena, didn't just influence the development of Christian architecture, it also influenced the very doctrines that define the Christian faith. So thanks for joining us. And I hope you'll join us next time for a discussion of the great Constantinian basilicas of Rome. Until then, cheerio for now.